The chamber had never been this quiet before. I had sat through 6 years of galactic conclave sessions and learned to read the silences. There was the silence after a delegate made a bad argument. There was the silence that meant everyone was pretending not to know the answer. And there was the silence that meant something had just shifted in a way no one was ready for. This was the last kind. My name is Yael Oduya. I serve as Earth's diplomatic liaison to the Galactic Conclave, stationed on Verath Prime, a planet so old that its mountains had been worn flat by 3 different ice ages before humans had learned to write. I had chosen this career because I believed in conversation. I believed that if people, any people, sat long enough in the same room and talked honestly, they could find a way forward. I still believed that. I just no longer believed the conclave was a room where honest conversation was welcome. The vote had taken 11 minutes. 47 species, their flags and sigils glowing above their seats in the curved chamber, had decided in 11 minutes that the 40,000 human colonists on Mirith 4 were no longer legal occupants of their own homes. The Thessari Compact had filed the claim 3 days ago. They did not message us beforehand. They did not raise a concern. They simply submitted a document to the Conclave's territorial registry, a document that had been backdated 31 years, through a legal mechanism so obscure that I had needed 2 lawyers and a translation specialist to even understand it. The document said, in careful and precise language, that Mirith 4 had been within the Thessari sphere of sovereign interest since before humanity reached that star system. It said the human presence there was therefore an unauthorized settlement on Thessari territory. It said the 40,000 people who had built their lives on that planet, who had planted farms and raised children and buried their dead in that soil, were trespassers. I had spent 72 hours working every diplomatic channel I had. I called in favors from species I had helped in previous sessions. I sent formal objections through 3 different legal mechanisms. I requested emergency hearings. I wrote personal messages to delegates I considered friends, or at least something close to it. 31 species abstained from the vote. They did not say no. They did not say yes. They simply sat on their hands and looked at the middle distance and told themselves they had not done anything wrong. 9 species voted in favor of the annexation. The Thessari voted for their own claim, as was their right under conclave procedure, and 8 others followed. I recognized the logic. The Thessari were old and powerful, and controlled 3 transit lanes that most of those 8 species used for trade. It was not principle. It was arithmetic. 7 species voted against. I had expected more, but 7 was what we got. And then, before the vote was even formally recorded, 3 of those 7 filed their own counter-petitions, claiming portions of the Mirith system for themselves under different legal mechanisms. They had voted against the Thessari claim while preparing their own. I sat in the observer gallery and watched the final tally appear on the chamber's display. Around me, human staff members, aides and analysts and translators, were very still. No one spoke. No one needed to. We all understood what we were looking at. I pulled out my personal communicator and typed a single message to the office of the Secretary General on Earth. The message contained 4 words. They have done it. I sent it, and waited. In the chamber below, the conclave's presiding officer, a tall, slow-moving creature from a species called the Ven, announced the formal passage of the Mirith territorial claim. She had a voice like low wind through old trees. She sounded almost sorry. I did not think she was. My communicator vibrated 4 minutes and 17 seconds later. The response from the Secretary General's office was longer than I expected. It began with 2 sentences that were procedural: instructions to secure communications channels, and confirm diplomatic staff locations. Then it gave me a file code. I opened the file. I had known these codes existed. Every Earth diplomat at the senior level was briefed on them during orientation, in a room with no windows and a very serious man, who explained that the codes were theoretical, that they existed as a contingency, that in the history of humanity's membership in the conclave they had never been used. He had said this with the particular emphasis of someone who deeply hoped the codes would remain theoretical forever. The codes authorized a full diplomatic withdrawal and escalation to active belligerent status. I read the file twice. Then I read it a 3rd time, more slowly, because I wanted to be completely certain I understood what I was being asked to do. At the bottom of the file was a direct line from the Secretary General herself, not staff, not a form letter, but a personal note. It said, Yael, we know what this will cost. Do it clearly, do it calmly, and make sure they understand every word. I put the communicator in my pocket. I straightened my jacket. I looked down at the chamber floor, at 47 species arranged in their perfect diplomatic semicircle, at the presiding officer already moving to the next item on the agenda, as if erasing 40,000 lives from their homes was simply a morning's work. Then I stood up. In the conclave observer gallery, you are not permitted to speak. You are not permitted to interrupt proceedings. You are not permitted to approach the floor without a formal request, submitted in writing, at least 48 hours in advance. These rules existed for good reasons, and I had followed every one of them for 6 years. I stood up, and I walked to the gallery rail, and I spoke. The translator units in the chamber, small silver devices embedded in every seat and surface, converted my words into the 47 languages simultaneously. I know because I had helped test them once, years ago, as a junior aide, and I remembered thinking how remarkable it was that such a small machine could carry so many voices at once. I said, "The United Earth Government is hereby withdrawing all personnel from conclave observer status, effective immediately. Earth formally declares a state of active belligerence against the Thesari Compact and against any party that enforces the Mirith territorial claim. You have 72 hours to reverse this decision. We will not ask again." The chamber went completely still. Not the polite silence of disagreement, not the calculated silence of political maneuvering, something deeper, something that happens when a room full of old and powerful minds suddenly realizes that a situation has moved beyond their models for it. The Thesari delegate was a tall, gray-blue figure with a resonance crest along the top of its skull. When Thesari are calm, the crest hums at a low, even frequency. When they are alarmed, it shifts. I watched the delegate's crest shift. The sound it made was not quite a sound a human ear could name, but it traveled through the chamber, and every species present heard it and understood it, because that particular frequency meant the same thing in every Thesari emotional register. It meant, this was not supposed to happen. The presiding officer called for order. Aides rushed toward the gallery. The human staff around me were already moving according to the emergency protocols we had drilled once a year and never expected to actually use. I walked out of the chamber ahead of the conclave security officers, and I did not look back. Outside, in the wide corridor of pale stone that ran around the building's upper level, my senior aide, a young man named Philip Garrett who had been with me for 2 years and who I trusted completely, was already on his communicator coordinating the withdrawal. He looked at me with an expression that contained, in roughly equal parts, professional focus and the controlled expression of a person who is not going to let themselves think too hard about what was happening. "Transport is 12 minutes out," he said. "Everyone is accounted for." "Good," I said. We walked together toward the transit hub, and behind us, through the great stone walls of the Galactic Conclave's chamber, I could hear the building noise of 47 species, trying to calculate what came next. They had 72 hours. And I knew something none of them did yet. I knew what was waiting on the other side of that deadline. I had seen the second file, the classified one that came attached to the authorization codes, the one that contained a number. The number was 1,847. I had not fully understood what it meant yet. I would. Admiral Seo Jin-woo was eating a cold meal at her desk when the final diplomatic withdrawal was confirmed. She set down her fork, read the confirmation twice, and pressed the COM button on her desk panel. "Navigation," she said. "Begin the translation sequence. All groups." She did not sound excited. She did not sound afraid. She sounded like a person who had been waiting a very long time for a particular appointment and was now simply going to it. Her name was Seo Jin-woo, and she had served in the Earth Defense Force for 23 years, the last 9 as fleet commander of what was officially designated the Terran Expeditionary Reserve, a title so bureaucratic and forgettable that it had appeared in exactly 2 conclave intelligence reports in the 6 years of its existence, both times as a footnote. That was intentional. The reserve was not, in fact, a reserve. It was the result of 40 years of decisions made by people who had read history carefully and drawn a specific conclusion from it. The conclusion was this: the galaxy had rules for the powerful, and different rules for everyone else. And the only way to change that was to stop being the kind of species the powerful could afford to ignore. So they had built. Not loudly. Not with the kind of visible military expansion that would trigger conclave monitoring protocols and diplomatic objections. They had built in quiet, over decades, in shipyards located in asteroid belts and at the edges of systems that received very little traffic. They had built with the patience of people who hoped the ships would never be needed, but who had looked at what happened to civilizations like the Lithori and the Marak and the Sesson, species that had trusted the Conclave's protections and found them hollow when it mattered, and decided that hope was not enough. The Conclave's intelligence files on humanity listed 340 registered vessels. The number was accurate. Every one of those ships existed, and was exactly where the records said it was. The files did not list the other ships, because the other ships had never been registered. They had been built under construction classifications that described them as resource extraction platforms, scientific survey vessels, and long-range communication relays. The descriptions were not entirely false. Each class of ship had been designed with those functions in mind as secondary systems, included specifically so that inspections, when they happened, would find exactly what the records claimed. Admiral Seo had taken command of the Expeditionary Reserve 8 years ago, and in those 8 years she had run her crews through more training scenarios than most active fleets ran in a generation. Her captains did not know how to follow orders, the way conclave military doctrine defined following orders. They knew how to think. They knew how to improvise. They knew how to look at a situation that had gone wrong in 3 different ways simultaneously and find the angle that none of those 3 problems had covered. She had selected them for exactly that. She stood at the forward observation port of her flagship, a vessel called the Constance, and watched the stars as the translation drive began its cycle. The drive created what physicists called a fold in local spacetime, a technical description that she had always found inadequate for the experience of watching space itself bend around a hull. It looked, from inside, like the universe taking a slow breath. Around the Constance, in formation that stretched across a volume of space large enough to contain several small solar systems, 1,846 other ships began the same process. The fold took 40 seconds. It always took 40 seconds regardless of distance, which was one of the more philosophically unsettling facts about faster-than-light travel. Seo used the 40 seconds, as she always did, to drink the last of her coffee and think about the people waiting on the other side. Not the Thesari, the colonists on Mirith 4th, 40,000 people who had built something real on a planet far from Earth. She had read the colony's census reports as part of her mission briefing. There was a university there, only 10 years old but already producing graduates who were staying on Mirith rather than going back to Earth, which meant the colony had reached the point where it felt like home, rather than an outpost. There were farms that had taken 15 years to get right, because Mirith's soil had a different mineral balance than anything Earth's agricultural science had prepared for, and the farmers who figured it out had written papers about it that were now used in training programs on 3 other colony worlds. There were children who had been born on Mirith who had never seen Earth, who had grown up under a slightly different shade of sky, whose home was a planet someone had just decided, in an 11-minute vote, was not theirs. The fold completed. Space settled. Stars rearranged into the configuration of the Mirith system. Seo looked at her tactical display and saw the Mirith planetary body, blue-green at this distance, a small, real, lived-in world hanging in the dark. She also saw the Thesari fleet. It was positioned between the fold-in point and the planet, which was tactically sound. The Thesari fought in what their doctrine called precision lattice formation, a method of combat coordination so tightly synchronized that individual ships in their fleets did not make independent decisions. They operated as a single distributed mind, each vessel a cell in a larger organism, each action the product of collective calculation rather than individual judgment. It was, by most measures, a highly effective approach. The Thesari had not lost a fleet engagement in over 2 centuries. Seo counted their ships on the display, 230 vessels, a significant force, arranged in the lattice pattern her analysts had modeled extensively. They were well positioned. Their formation covered the approach vectors with clean interlocking fields of fire. They had not yet moved. She watched the Thesari fleet and understood why. They were running calculations. processing the sensor data, counting. They were counting her ships. She gave them time to finish. Philip Garrett's voice reached her through a communication forwarded from Yael's transport. Admiral, the diplomatic withdrawal is complete. All personnel are clear of Thesari jurisdiction. The 72-hour window is closed. Seo acknowledged the message. Then she opened a channel to the Thesari Fleet Command. She identified herself and her rank and the name of her vessel, because military protocol required it, and then she said what she had been authorized to say. This is Admiral Seo Jin-woo, commanding the Terran Expeditionary Force. Mireth IV is an Earth colony under the protection of the United Earth Government. You are in contested space. You have 1 hour to withdraw your fleet from this system. If you do not withdraw, we will move to enforce our territorial claim. This is the only communication you will receive before we act. She closed the channel. Her tactical officer, a composed young woman named Clara Baines, looked up from her console. They're reforming the lattice, Admiral. Tightening the gaps. I see it, Seo said. The Thesari were not going to withdraw. She had known they would not. They had run their models. They had the numbers. 230 ships against a force that the Conclave's records said contained 340. Even accounting for surprise, even accounting for the new vessels they were still processing, their calculations told them this was a contest they could win. Their calculations were about to encounter new information. Seo turned to her fleet communications officer, a steady man named Owen Marsh, who had been with her for 6 years. Owen, open fleet-wide. Open, Admiral. She spoke calmly and directly, the way she always addressed her crews, without theater or false gravity. All units. This is the Admiral. Mireth IV is ahead of us. 40,000 people are on that planet right now, waiting to find out if they still have a home. I do not intend to disappoint them. Execute your engagement protocols and look after each other. That is all. She closed the fleet channel. Clara Baines said very quietly, the Thesari lattice is locking firing solutions. Then let's go, Seo said. The Constance moved forward, and behind her, 1,846 ships moved with it. The Thesari commander had positioned his fleet well. His lattice formation functioned as designed, concentrating coordinated fire with extraordinary precision. In the first 40 minutes of the engagement, 3 Earth vessels were destroyed, and 9 were damaged badly enough to fall back. The lattice was doing what lattices were built to do, maintaining pressure, closing angles, forcing the opposing force to respond rather than act. The problem was that Earth captains were not very good at simply responding. The tactical situation, as the Thesari commander processed it, was that his formation was holding. What his models did not account for was the texture of what he was holding against. Earth ships did not behave as a unified system. They moved in ways that defied pattern recognition because they were not following a pattern. Each captain was making decisions based on what they personally observed, what they personally judged, and what they personally thought their specific neighbors needed. Captain Daniel Ford of the frigate Alcott decided, without orders and without consulting anyone, that the gap between the Thesari's 3rd and 4th lattice columns was 1/4 of a degree wider than doctrine would have placed it. He messaged 3 neighboring captains with a handwritten observation, not through the tactical network, through a direct short-range signal in a format so basic it was barely digital, specifically because he thought their main communications might be monitored. The 4 of them used that gap. The lattice, which was not designed to respond to actions originating from inside its own formation, because that was supposed to be impossible, took 11 seconds to recalculate. 11 seconds, in fleet combat, is a very long time. In the 3rd hour, a supply corridor that the Thesari had identified and severed was rebuilt by a group of 8 Earth captains who drove their ships through an asteroid field that Thesari sensors had classified as impassable. Later analysis confirmed the sensors were not wrong. The field was genuinely dangerous. The 8 captains went through it anyway, at reduced speed, talking each other through it on an open channel that the Thesari later recovered. The recovered audio contained, in the middle of navigating through a field of tumbling rock in active combat conditions, an extended argument about whether a particular sports team had made the right decision in a match played 7 months earlier. The argument was unresolved when the ships emerged on the other side and re-established the supply line. The Thesari commander noted this in his report. He wrote that he could not determine whether the conversation was coded communication or genuine distraction, and that the uncertainty itself was tactically destabilizing. In the fifth hour, a destroyer named the Forthright took a critical hit to its propulsion system and lost 2/3 of its maneuverability. Its captain, a woman named Louise Henry, did not withdraw. She positioned her ship at a fixed point that happened to cover 3 approach vectors and used the Forthright's remaining weapons as a stationary platform. She kept her crew informed about their situation, with a directness that her later testimony described simply as, "They deserved to know what we were working with." The Forthright held its position for 4 hours. It was still there when the engagement ended. The moment the Thesari commander later identified as the turn of the battle was not a tactical one. It was when his sensor operators reported that they were detecting a particular type of audio transmission from the largest concentration of Earth vessels. The transmission was being broadcast on a frequency not used for tactical communication. It took his signals team 20 minutes to identify it. It was music. A group of approximately 60 Earth ships had opened a shared audio channel, and one crew was performing a song that his translation systems identified as a piece of early 21st century popular music. The other ships were listening. Some of them were joining in. This was happening while they were engaged in active combat operations. His report to the Thesari High Command, written after the battle, contained a sentence that his superiors later described as the most important strategic assessment of the century. He wrote, "I have concluded that we modeled human military capacity with precision and human psychology not at all. These are not 2 separate errors. They are the same error." The Thesari fleet withdrew from the Mirith system in the 8th hour, having suffered losses they had not believed possible against an opponent of Earth's registered strength. They withdrew in good order, because the Thesari were professional and composed even in defeat, and because Admiral Sio did not pursue them past the system's edge. She had given them a way out. That was not mercy exactly. It was clarity. She wanted them to leave. She wanted them to go back to the conclave and tell everyone what they had seen. When the last Thesari ship folded out of the Marith system, the fleet-wide channel opened on its own. Someone on one of the ships pressed a button, or opened a line, and from somewhere in the formation came a sound that was part cheer and part something harder to name. The sound traveled through the comms network, and Sio listened to it from the bridge of the Constance and did not try to stop it. Clara Baines turned from her console with an expression that was trying very hard to stay professional and not quite managing it. "They're gone, Admiral." "Yes," Sio said, "they are." She was already reading the first wave of communications from the conclave. The signals were coming in faster than her comm team could organize them. 47 species, all at once, trying to understand what they had just watched on their long-range sensors. She handed the comm traffic to Owen Marsh and told him to prioritize anything from non-Thesari parties. Then she walked to the observation port and looked at Mirith 4. The planet was quiet from here, small and blue-green, and completely unaware of how close it had come to being someone else's property. She thought about the farmers who had figured out the soil, the university 10 years old, the children who had never seen Earth. "Get me a channel to the colony administrator," she said. It took 3 minutes to establish. When the connection opened, the voice on the other end was a man named Gregory Cole, the colony's elected administrative head, whose voice was doing something complicated, between composure and relief. "Admiral," he said. "Mr. Cole," she said, "Mirith the Fourth is secure. You can stand your people down." There was a pause on the other end of the line, not a long one. Then Gregory Cole said, in a voice that had lost its composure entirely, and did not seem to care about that, "Thank you." Sio said, "Thank your planet. It's still yours." She closed the channel and went back to reading the conclave messages. There were a great many of them, and they were all saying, in 47 different languages, the same basic thing. They were saying, "We did not know." This is a recovered and translated document from the Thesari archive. It was submitted as formal testimony to the Mirith Accords process by Resonance of Iron, who held the rank of Fleet Mind Commander during the Mirith engagement. It is presented here in full. I am writing this because the Accords process has asked each party to provide an honest account of their experience during the Mirith engagement. I have considered whether honesty serves the Thesari Compact's interests in this context, and concluded that it does, because the alternative is to allow the same errors to be made again, and we cannot afford them. I will begin with what we knew. We knew that Earth had 340 registered warships. We knew their classified performance specifications, because specifications of that type circulate through conclave intelligence networks regardless of what any party intends. We knew their tactical doctrine, which was derived primarily from their historical conflicts with each other, and which our analysts assessed as functional but not sophisticated. We also knew, because we had observed it across 6 years of conclave interactions, that humans were emotionally driven. They argued with their officers. Their command structures allowed for disagreement in ways that ours do not. They made decisions based on individual judgment rather than collective optimization. We assessed all of this as weakness. I want to be precise here, because precision matters, and because I believe the conclave's member species deserve an accurate accounting. We were not wrong about any of those facts. The facts were correct. Our error was in what we concluded from them. Individual judgment, in our modeling, is inferior to collective optimization, because individual judgment introduces variability. Variability means some decisions will be suboptimal. In a system optimized for consistency, variability is a flaw. We did not understand, until the Mirith engagement, that variability can also mean that no opponent can fully predict you. Our lattice formation is extraordinarily effective against opponents who respond to it according to standard tactical doctrine. The lattice is designed to be responded to in specific ways, and to punish those responses. Every opposing force we have engaged has responded in approximately the ways our models predicted, because tactical doctrine, across the species we have encountered, tends towards similar solutions when faced with similar problems. Earth's captains did not respond according to tactical doctrine. They responded according to what they, individually, observed and judged. And because they were each observing and judging independently, their responses were not consistent with each other, which meant they were also not consistent with any model we had built. Captain Daniel Ford of the vessel Alcott identified a geometric flaw in our formation that our own lattice mind had assessed as within acceptable parameters. He identified it because he was looking at the specific part of the formation that he personally faced, with his own attention, rather than as part of a distributed awareness that was processing the entire engagement simultaneously. Individual focus produced a result that distributed awareness missed. This is not a conclusion I find comfortable. I record it because it is accurate. The supply corridor situation was more alarming. When we severed their resupply line, we did so because it was the tactically correct response to their formation's vulnerability, and because the mathematics of a force cut off from resupply in extended engagement are straightforward. The resupply line was not replaceable within the time frame we calculated. The asteroid field that bordered the corridor was dense enough to make transit at combat speeds effectively impossible. 8 Earth captains transited that field at reduced speed. They did not transit it because their tactical systems told them it was possible. Their tactical systems, we later confirmed from recovered logs, told them it was not advisable. They transited it because they talked to each other, shared observations about specific gaps they were each seeing from their individual positions, and collectively navigated something that no single ship's sensor picture would have been sufficient to handle. This is, I want to note, not meaningfully different from what our lattice does. The difference is that the lattice operates on synchronized data streams and optimized collective calculation, while those 8 captains operated on conversation, personal observation, and mutual trust. I spent considerable time analyzing why their method worked under those conditions, and arrived at this conclusion. Our collective intelligence is faster and more precise, but it is also predictable, because it always pursues the optimal solution. Their method is slower and less precise, but it generates solutions that the optimal solution-seeking process never considers, because those solutions require accepting inefficiency and risk in ways that collective optimization is specifically designed to avoid. They accepted inefficiency and risk. They went through the asteroid field because they decided it was worth it. The decision was not calculated. It was chosen. The audio recordings are the element of this testimony that I find most difficult to explain in terms that will be useful to the conclave, because I am not certain I understand them myself. We intercepted communications from Earth vessels throughout the engagement. A significant portion of those communications were tactically relevant, but a portion that I initially assumed was noise turned out to be deliberate. Earth crews talked to each other, not about tactics, about personal matters, about their families, about things that happened before the engagement, things unrelated to the engagement, things that have no operational value whatsoever. During the asteroid field transit, two captains debated the outcome of a sporting event. A crew on a damaged vessel reported that someone had made a warm beverage for the bridge staff. One ship's crew, at a moment when their tactical situation was genuinely uncertain, sang together on an open channel. I asked my analysis team what function this communication served, and they gave me answers that were technically plausible, but that I found unsatisfying. The answers involved morale maintenance and stress reduction, which are real functions, but which did not seem to capture what I was observing. What I was observing, I eventually concluded, was something like this. The crews were reminding themselves and each other that they were people, not components of a system, not functions within a collective. People, with histories and preferences and relationships, who happen to be doing something difficult and frightening together. Our lattice does not need that reminder, because the lattice does not have people in it in the relevant sense. It has participants, optimized, synchronized, collectively directed participants, who are at their most effective when individual identity is subsumed into collective function. Earth's crews were at their most effective when they remembered they were individuals. I do not know how to model this. I do not believe our modeling frameworks are currently capable of capturing it. This is, strategically, a significant problem. The last thing I will record is this. As the engagement progressed, and it became clear that we would not achieve our objectives, I found myself making a calculation I had not anticipated making. I was calculating not whether we could win, but how to disengage in a way that did not result in the complete destruction of my fleet. The Earth Admiral gave me that opportunity. She did not pursue us beyond the system boundary. She could have. Given her force composition, she almost certainly could have inflicted severe additional losses on my retreating fleet. She chose not to. I have thought about why. The most efficient explanation is that she had achieved her objective, Mirith 4 secured, and had no reason to expend further resources. This is probably accurate, but I also observed, in the communication logs from the conclave during the engagement, that every species with long-range sensors was watching, and I observed that the Earth Admiral was aware of this. She was not only fighting us, she was demonstrating something. To every species in the conclave that had run similar calculations to ours, that had looked at Earth and seen a species too young and too emotional to present a serious concern, she was showing them what those calculations had missed. And she showed it in a specific way. She showed power, and then she stopped. She could have continued, and she did not. I will admit that this made a stronger impression on me than any tactical outcome of the engagement. Any force can strike. The choice of when to stop is something different. It requires confidence that is not dependent on the continuation of force to maintain itself. That is the confidence of a party that knows it has made its point, and does not feel the need to belabor it. We had underestimated Earth. Every species in the conclave had underestimated Earth. The testimony I submit here is an attempt to be clear about exactly how and why, in the hope that the conclave moves forward with a more accurate understanding of the species it has admitted, poorly and late, into its full consideration. That is all I have to record. The first contact came on day 3. Not from the Thesari, from the Lithori. I was on board the Earth command ship Constance by then, having transferred from the diplomatic transport when it became clear that Verath Prime was no longer a safe location for Earth personnel. Admiral Seo had given me an office near the communications hub, a small room with a real porthole that looked out at the stars, and had told Philip Garrett that whatever I needed, within reason, he should find a way to provide. Philip had obtained a coffee machine from somewhere on the ship and had not explained how, and I had not asked. I was on my 3rd coffee when the Lithori message came in. The Lithori were not what the conclave would call a major species. They had been a significant civilization once, about 80 years ago, before the Thesari had done to them something similar to what they had just attempted with Mirith 4th, except that when the Lithori had faced it, there had been no Earth fleet waiting in a dark shipyard. There had only been the conclave, which had deliberated for 14 months, and ultimately concluded that the Thesari claim, while aggressive, did not violate any existing treaty the conclave was empowered to enforce. The Lithori had lost 2/3 of their settled territory in that process. They now occupied 4 small worlds at the edge of what used to be their space. They had full conclave membership, technically, but the kind of membership that means you get to attend meetings and watch decisions be made. The message from their speaker was addressed directly to me, not to Admiral CO, not to the Earth government through official channels. To me, personally, by name. It said, "We have been watching. We have something you need." It said, "We have been keeping records for 80 years of every Thesari installation not listed in any conclave registry." It said, "These charts are yours if you want them." I read the message twice. Then I forwarded it to Admiral CO with a note that said simply, "This is the beginning of something larger than Mirith." She replied 3 minutes later, "I know. Handle the Lithori. I'll handle the fleet." I spent 4 hours in careful communication with the Lithori speaker, a patient and precise individual named Adara Voss, who chose her words with the carefulness of someone who had learned, through long experience, that words in the wrong context could be very expensive. She did not want credit. She did not want a formal alliance. She wanted one thing, and she stated it without drama at the end of our second conversation. She said, "We want it to stop, not just for you. For all the small ones they have done this to." I told her I understood. I told her I would carry that forward. The Lithori charts arrived in our systems 12 hours later. Admiral Seo's tactical team spent 6 hours with them and emerged from that session with expressions that told me the charts were exactly as valuable as the Lithori had implied. The Macon Collective contacted us on day 5. I knew the Macan by reputation, and from a handful of formal trade interactions during my time at the Conclave. They were a quiet species, not small, not without resources, but deeply non-confrontational in their public posture. They had never been involved in any conclave dispute. They attended sessions, voted on matters of direct interest, and otherwise maintained a profile so low as to be nearly invisible. Their message was also addressed to me, and it was even more direct than the Lithoris. It said, "We have been waiting for someone to do this. What do you need?" I wrote back and asked what they were willing to offer. The reply was a list. It was a substantial list. The Macan had no warships. They had something potentially more useful in a conflict that was rapidly becoming as much political as military. They had relationships, quiet, long-standing, carefully tended relationships, with 12 species that the Conclave's formal power structure tended to overlook, species that were not large enough to matter individually, but that, the Macan gently pointed out, collectively represented 11 votes on any conclave resolution. 11 votes that, up until this moment, had consistently abstained on any matter involving the major powers, because abstaining was the only safe position for a species that could not protect itself from retaliation. What would change that? I asked Adara Voss during our next conversation, because she and the Macan speaker had begun conferring, and I had realized, with a sensation I can only describe as a kind of productive vertigo, that I was watching something organize itself around us. Adara thought about it for a moment. "Seeing that it is possible to push back," she said finally. "They have watched for a long time. They did not believe pushing back was survivable. Now they have a different data point. We had fired the first shot, but what was building was not a war. It was a correction." On day 7, the Voranti hegemony moved a fleet group toward the Mirith system. The Voranti were the second largest military power in the Conclave and treaty partners of the Thesari. Their arrival was, on paper, the moment the situation became genuinely dangerous. CO briefed me on the fleet group's composition, and I spent 40 minutes reading the assessment with a feeling in my chest that I recognized as fear being carefully managed. Then Philip Garrett walked in with coffee and a secondary intelligence report and said, very calmly, "The Voranti fleet group has stopped at the edge of the Mireth approach corridor and is holding position." I looked at him. "They're not advancing," he confirmed. "They're sitting." The Voranti were calculating, the same way the Thesari had calculated before the engagement, running their models, counting ships. Adding the new variable of Lithori intelligence assets and Macan political coordination and whatever their sensors were showing them about the 14 additional vessels that had quietly joined our formation in the last 48 hours, sent by species whose names were not on any treaty with Earth, but who had decided, for their own reasons, that this was a moment that mattered. The Voranti fleet executor, A figure whose title translated roughly as Senior Commander with Final Strategic Authority, sent a communication on day 9. It was addressed to Admiral Seo. It said, "We wish to discuss terms before this becomes something none of us can stop." Seo read it and handed it to me without comment. I read it twice. Then I noticed something. The message used the word us, not you and we, not Earth and the hegemony. The word us. I showed this to Seo. She nodded, and I thought I saw something shift in her expression, something that was not quite relief, but was in the same neighborhood. I drafted the response. I told the Varanti that Earth was prepared to discuss terms. I told them that the conversation would take place at a location of Earth's choosing, which I had not yet determined, and that they would come to us, rather than the reverse. I wrote this firmly but without hostility, because the goal was not to humiliate the Varanti. The goal was to establish, clearly and early, that this conversation was happening because they had chosen to seek it, not because Earth needed it to stop. Seo reviewed the draft and suggested 2 small changes that made it more direct. Then she added a line at the bottom that was, I told her, possibly the most purely human sentence I had ever read in a diplomatic document. She had written, Admiral Seo requests that any delegation traveling to the meeting bring sufficient provisions for the journey, as our crew has been consuming field rations for 11 days, and the mood is beginning to reflect this. I sent a more formal version of that request, but only slightly more formal. The Varanti agreed to the terms within 6 hours. I spent that evening in the small office with the real porthole, reading the accumulated message traffic from the conclave. There were hundreds of communications by now. The political picture was fragmenting in ways that would take months to fully map. Old alliances were under strain. Quiet parties were making noise for the first time. Species that had been on opposite sides of disputes for decades were suddenly exchanging messages that had the careful, tentative quality of the first words spoken after a long silence. Philip brought a second cup of coffee around midnight and sat across from me without being asked, which I appreciated. It's not just about Mirith anymore, he said. No, I agreed. Is that what we intended? I thought about it honestly, the way you have to when someone you trust asks you a direct question. I think, I said slowly, that we intended to bring 40,000 people home, and that what's happening now is what that looks like in a place that hasn't seen anyone stand up for something small in a very long time. He was quiet for a moment. Through the porthole, the stars held their positions with the indifference they always maintained. We're going to be here a while, Philip said. Yes, I said. We are. The Mirith Accords took 63 days to negotiate. I know that number precisely because I kept a record. Every session, every day, every late-night conversation in corridors between formal meetings, when the real work of diplomacy happens, when people who have spent the day arguing carefully say what they actually think to someone they have come to, cautiously, trust. The sessions were held on a neutral platform, a research station called Athen Point, owned jointly by 3 species that had no stake in the Mirith dispute, and which had offered the space with a quiet urgency that told me they understood how important it was that there be somewhere genuinely neutral to meet. Athen Point was not comfortable. It was a working research station, not a diplomatic facility. The conference rooms smelled like recycled air and old documents, and the particular exhaustion of people who have been trying hard for a long time. I found I liked it. The opening session had 41 delegations, not all 47 conclave members, because the Thessari Compact initially refused to participate in a process they described as premature formalization, and 4 species closely aligned with them declined in solidarity. They all attended by day 4, because it had become clear that whatever was decided at Athen Point was going to determine the shape of the conclave for the next generation, and no one could afford to be absent for that. I led Earth's delegation. Admiral Seo attended the first session and the last, which was the right choice. Her presence was important as a statement of seriousness and as a reminder of what had happened at Mirith, but the accords needed to be built by people who were choosing words rather than positions, and Seo was the first to say that was not her primary skill. The Thessari came to the table with a negotiator named Clarity Through Stillness, whose title I eventually understood was roughly equivalent to the one who speaks when the compact needs to say something it does not want to say. Clarity Through Stillness was old, even by Thesari reckoning, and communicated at a frequency my translator had to work hard to render into language. She was not warm. She was, however, precise, and in my experience, precision in an opponent is something to appreciate, because it means they can be held to what they say. The first week was about Mirith Fourth. That part was, in relative terms, straightforward. The Thesari Compact had made a claim. The claim had been contested. The contest had produced an outcome. The territorial registry entry would be voided, the colony would be restored to full legal status, and a framework would be established for resolving similar disputes through a tribunal process that did not allow backdating of claims without independent verification. Clarity through stillness did not object to any of this. She sat through it with the composed stillness her name suggested, and agreed to terms that, a month earlier, the Thesari Compact would have described as unthinkable. I understood why. Not because the Thesari had changed their nature, because the calculation had changed. The galaxy was watching. 12 species were at the table, who would not have been there a year ago. The Lithori had a seat, formally, for the first time since their displacement. The Makan had brought 7 of their quietly networked partners into direct participation in the process. Something that had been invisible was now visible, and that visibility changed what was possible. The second week was harder. The second week was about the Lithori. The Lithori claim had existed for 80 years. Their displacement was documented in conclave records with the kind of thorough accuracy that made it worse rather than better to read, because it was all there. The process, the vote, the legal reasoning, the formal conclusion that nothing enforceable had been violated. 80 years of paperwork describing how a civilization had been diminished, and the conclave had decided it was not empowered to do anything about it. Adara Voss presented the Lithori case herself. She spoke for 4 hours, without notes, in a quiet voice that required the chamber's audio system to be adjusted upward. She described what the Lithori had lost in terms of specific things: research stations, agricultural settlements, educational institutions, historical sites. She named places. She named years. She named, where records allowed, individual people. She did not argue. She did not accuse. She simply described. When she finished, the room was very still. The species that had voted for the original Thesari claim against the Lithori 80 years ago were not the same species that sat at this table. Not literally, because individuals had lived and been replaced by others over those decades. But the institutional memory was there. The records were there. Several of the delegations present had, in their conclave files, the vote of their predecessor representatives on the original Lithori matter. The negotiation over the Lithori restitution was, ultimately, the session that most changed the character of the accords. It moved the document from being a resolution of the Mirith dispute to being something with larger ambitions. The final language recognized the Lithori's sovereignty claim to 3 of the 4 territories they had lost, and committed the conclave to a tribunal process for the 4th, which involved complicating factors that the language honestly admitted would take time to resolve. The Thesari agreed to contribute to a material reparations fund. Clarity through stillness stated, in the formal record, that the compact acknowledged the history of the Lithori situation and expressed regret for the disruption caused by past actions. This was, as I noted privately to Philip, not an apology in any sense that most humans would recognize, but it was in the record, permanently, and the word regret was there in Thesari formal language, in a way that could not be unsaid. The Makan Collective received full conclave membership in the 4th week. The vote was 29 in favor, 11 abstentions, and 2 opposed, which was the Thesari Compact, and 1 small party, voting in solidarity. The Makan speaker, a deliberate and undemonstrative individual named Oren Hale, accepted the membership with a brief speech that thanked no one specifically and committed the Makan to active participation in conclave processes. Oren Hale had the expression of someone who had waited so long for something that its arrival felt more like inevitability than victory. In the 5th week, 3 other species filed petitions for recognition of disputed territorial claims. The petitions were placed on the primary agenda, not the supplemental one. This was a procedural change so small it required no vote, just a decision by the presiding officer, who made it without comment. I had spent 3 days in private conversation with that presiding officer, and I believe she had been waiting for a reason to make that decision for some time. The Voranti hegemony, for their part, negotiated separately from the main accords, but in parallel, a bilateral framework with Earth that clarified transit rights and mutual non-interference provisions in a region of space where both parties had overlapping interests. Admiral Seo attended those sessions with an attitude that I would describe as firm patience, which is the diplomatic approach of someone who knows they have the stronger position and has decided not to be unpleasant about it because they want the agreement to hold. The Voranti were professional and direct. They did not apologize for having sent a fleet group. They did not reference the Myrith engagement directly, except in the factual terms required to establish context. What they did was negotiate as though Earth was a party that needed to be taken seriously, which they had not done before, and which told me everything I needed to know about how their internal calculations had shifted. The final session of the Myrith Accords was a full plenary. 43 delegations, the Thessari Compact, the Lithori, the Makan Collective, the Voranti, the 7 species that had voted against the original annexation, the 12 that had come to the table through the Makan's network, species whose names I had barely known 6 months ago, and Earth. The document was signed in the order of conclave membership seniority, which meant the oldest established members went first, and Earth went toward the end, which was fine. I had not come to Athen Point to make a statement about seniority. When it was my turn, I signed the document and set down the stylus and looked up at the room. 43 delegations, species of shapes and sizes and histories that I had spent 6 years trying to understand, and would spend the rest of my career continuing to try. Some of them were there because they believed in what the Accords represented. Some were there because their calculations had told them it was strategically necessary. Some were there for reasons I probably did not fully understand, and might never understand completely. All of them were there. Ambassador T. Siral of the Keth Empire, the oldest delegate in the room, had been watching me with the patient attention of someone who has observed a great many events from a very long perspective. She was the last delegate to sign after me, and when she set down her own stylus, she turned and looked at me with an expression I had learned, over 6 years of interactions, to read as something close to genuine curiosity. That evening, in the corridor outside the plenary chamber, she found me alone. She moved slowly, as the Keth always did, their physiology built for a world with stronger gravity than most. She had 4 centuries of conclave sessions behind her eyes, and a patience that I sometimes found more unsettling than the impatient species. She said, "You know what the other species talk about, when they talk about humans in private sessions?" I said I did not, which was partially true. She said, "They talk about the fact that you seem to believe this matters. All of it. Every time. Not the outcome. The thing itself. We find this very difficult to predict." I thought about that for a moment. About Myrith Fourth and the 40,000 people who had built something real there. About the Lithori and 80 years of careful documentation kept against a day that had finally arrived. About the 8 captains in the asteroid field, talking each other through the dark. About the song on the open channel. About what it meant to believe something was worth showing up for. "Is that a problem?" I asked. T. Siral considered. 4 centuries of consideration packed into a few seconds. "It is a change," she said. "We are still deciding what to do with it." She moved away down the corridor, slow and unhurried, and I watched her go. Philip appeared beside me, with the particular quiet efficiency that I had come to think of as his signature approach to everything. He had a tablet in his hand with the preliminary vote count for the first round of Accords implementation procedures, which was already being contested in 17 different ways by 11 different parties, because the conclave was the conclave, and nothing was simple the moment you stopped paying direct attention to it. "Ready?" he said. I looked down the corridor where T. Siral had gone. Then I looked at the tablet Philip was holding, full of the complicated ongoing work of making what had been decided here actually mean something in practice. I took the tablet. "Yes," I said. The Myrith Accords were signed. The Lithori were going home, at least partway home, which was more than they had been able to say for 80 years. 40,000 people on a colony planet were safe in their beds tonight. A process had started, imperfect and contested and fragile in the way that all new things are fragile, that might, over time, change how the conclave operated for everyone it was supposed to serve. None of it was finished. It was barely started. There would be other Myreths, Other moments when someone powerful decided that someone smaller did not matter enough to protect. There would be votes in that chamber that would make me furious. There would be years when the progress was so slow as to be nearly invisible. But something had shifted. The old assumption, the quiet one that ran under everything, the assumption that Earth was a young species that could be managed and overlooked, and that the calculations would always work out in favor of patience. That assumption had been updated. We had gone to Mirith for 40,000 people, on a planet most of the galaxy could not have found on a star chart. We had asked for nothing, except what was already ours. We had fought when we had to, stopped when we should, and then we had walked into a room full of species with centuries of habit and history, and had simply continued talking, until the room was different. That was what humans did. It turned out, after a great deal of time, and a great deal of looking the other way, the galaxy had finally noticed. Philip was already walking toward the communications center, the tablet tucked under his arm, making calls with the efficient energy of someone who understood that the document being signed was not the end of the work, but the beginning of the part that required endurance. I followed him. There was still a great deal to do.